what is a for-profit prison, right? Like literally, like what is a for-profit prison? I feel like YouTube had answers.
Today, the U.S. imprisons more people, both per capita and in terms of number of people incarcerated, than any other country in the world. Of approximately 10 million people currently incarcerated worldwide, over 2 million of them are imprisoned in the U.S., with a rate of around 655 people imprisoned for every 100,000 residents. And this rise in the number of incarcerated Americans also aligns chronologically with another trend in the justice system: the rise of private prisons. Many people are wary of the practice of privatizing our penal system because of news stories over the years about corrupt dealings between lawyers, judges, and prison owners and managers who arrange to have people incarcerated in exchange for cash. But there's also a series of deeper moral and historical questions that stem out of this topic. And the primary questions are, what is the purpose and function of a prison? Are they designed to punish, to isolate those who break the law from the rest of the population, or are they actually places where justice, reconciliation, and reform can happen?
Shouldn't they be a place of all three? Like, aren't prisons supposed to remove you from the general society as a punishment? And in doing so, they're also supposed to put you on a path to, reform and reconcile, or depending on, the crime and what you did.
If prisons are now the responsibility of the state and the private sector, then what responsibility do they have to the populations they house? And does privatizing them change those responsibilities? Even though private prisons in the US have a relatively short history, with the first modern private prison opening in 1984 in Tennessee, the US penal system's relationship to private money stretches back much further than that. Because the initial relationship between incarceration and private industry didn't focus on governments paying prison operators to house prisoners. Rather, it focused on extracting free labor from incarcerated populations. Up until the 18th century in Western Europe and the US, most of the conversations about the role and function of prisons centered heavily on punishment. Prisoners were to be isolated from the rest of the population for their crimes and were expected to suffer acutely. Think dungeons, corporal punishment, and executions. The prisons themselves were more of a way station for the ultimate punishment. But extracting money from prisoners, either through fines or labor, was also a common practice beginning in the medieval period in Western Europe, then later in the US. This usually came in the form of debtors' prisons, where people unable to pay their bills were held until they could come up with the money or work off their literal debts to society with unpaid labor. Debtors could, in theory, leave the prisons once the debts had been repaid in full, but debtors' prisons were slowly abolished until they were closed entirely in the US and Europe in the mid-19th century because they disproportionately targeted the poor. Meanwhile, the 19th century also saw the emergence of a few key changes in the philosophy and functions of prisons. First, many prisons became places of long-term captivity, in effect becoming the primary home of punished populations and not just holding zones until other, harsher punishments could be netted out. The second major shift in the discussion of prison cultures in the 19th century also came in the form of prison reform. Reform took two major strands: living conditions and ideologies. Prison reformers like Dorothea Dix lobbied to improve the living conditions of long-term prisoners, many of whom were mentally ill and abused by the guards tasked with their care. At the same time, other reformers focused on the mission and purpose of incarceration, claiming that prisons had a moral responsibility to rehabilitate incarcerated people and reintegrate them into society. Even after the US outlawed debtors' prisons as inhumane in 1833, the relationship between state power, criminal punishment, and money continued throughout the 19th century. One of the primary vehicles for this was the convict leasing system. In her book, Professor Mary Ellen Curtin details the rise of the convict leasing system after the Civil War. The US southern states found themselves in financial ruin. There was infrastructural damage caused by the battles, and their economy had been anchored by the practices of legal slavery. After legal abolition, they looked to other ways to recover financially from the ravages of war, while also severely limiting the legal rights and protections of newly emancipated Black citizens. As a result, they expanded the convict leasing system. Under convict leasing, private businesses could lease a prisoner from the state. In exchange for housing, clothing, and feeding the convict, the contractors, which ranged from big factories to coal mines to private plantations, paid the government a small fee. Convict leasing effectively reinstated the terms of legal slavery under a different name. In order to increase their revenue, states began arresting African Americans at increased rates for crimes that were vaguely defined, such as vagrancy or thefts. And even though some of these crimes were a result of overwhelming poverty and lack of opportunity in the region, many of them were charges that were designed to target poor black communities and poor white communities, although in smaller numbers overall. As a result, prisons in Alabama that were primarily housing white prisoners before the war became overwhelmingly filled with poor black prisoners by the 1870s. As convict leasing became a source of cheap labor for business owners and a steady stream of revenue for southern states determined to the system expanded. Although it was primarily used in southern states, northern states weren't entirely opposed to the system since it was financially profitable, even though it effectively reinstated legal slavery. For prisoners, time spent under the dominion of contractors could be excessively brutal, with sentences often unofficially extended far past when their terms of service were supposed to be over. Under the guise of building a new South from the ashes of conflict, convict leasing really desired to return to the same South grounded in the premise of class and racial inequality, with a large unpaid workforce underpinning the social structure. As convict leasing became less common in the early 20th century before ending altogether, it did give way to other forms of profiting off of the labor of convicts, like the chain gangs famously depicted in films and literature. Professor Angela Davis in her book details the connections between early precedents like convict leasing and the rise of what prison abolitionists have termed the prison industrial complex of the 20th and 21st centuries. The prison industrial complex is a term to describe the relationship between private industries and incarceration. Davis points out that at the beginning of her career as a prison rights advocate and prison abolitionist in the late 1960s, there were close to 200,000 Americans in prison. By the early 2000s, that number had skyrocketed to 2 million.
Damn.
In part, it was associated with a domino effect of policy decisions in the latter half of the 20th century that disproportionately targeted vulnerable populations. So our social behaviors and shifts in the law created a context in which more people were considered criminals or subject to being held prisoner. Just like with convict leasing after the Civil War, the government turned to private contractors and business owners to find a place to house a new influx of created criminals. Beginning in the 1980s, the government looked to private prisons as a potential relief, in addition to building many new publicly run prisons. These policy changes effectively swelled the number of people considered criminals and saw a huge increase in the number of residents placed in prison. Individual states from the 1960s through the end of the century began to increase the number of facilities they built, and starting in the 1980s, the prison population swelled as a result of Reagan-era war on drug policies that targeted non-violent drug offenders with hefty jail sentences in order to tackle the rising specter of drug addiction in this country. These same policies were continued through subsequent Republican and Democratic administrations in the 1990s. As a result, many poor people and people of color began to fill prisons at an increased rate, since those populations were also more likely to be surveilled for non-violent drug offenses. Additionally, there was a move towards deinstitutionalizing psychiatric patients that took place beginning in the 1950s and 1960s. Many long-term care facilities for people with ongoing mental health issues up until that point operated largely in the same way as prisons. Facilities were overcrowded, patients were detained without consent or the ability to leave, and in some cases suffered abuse at the hands of their caregivers. But as state-funded psychiatric facilities closed, the number of people in need of long-term care essentially shifted into the prison system. This was in part because many of these newly released patients became homeless and could be picked up for things like squatting or committing petty crimes in order to survive. When patients suffering from mental health issues are brought into emergency rooms, where they can usually only remain for around 72 hours, there isn't a consistent bridge between emergency care and long-term care, especially because the country as a whole has a limited number of beds in safe psychiatric facilities. And by some counts, there are approximately twice as many people suffering from mental illness in US prisons than there are in US psychiatric hospitals.
Wow.
Even though many medical experts agree there is no positive correlation between mental health and committing violent crimes. So private prisons were looked to as a way of cutting the cost of increased incarceration that occurred as a result of major policy shifts. But it's unclear if private prisons actually serve their intended purpose, to save the government money. However, they do make up a relatively small percentage of the overall number of prisons in the country. In 2016, privately owned prisons only accounted for about 8.5% of the total prison population, according to the Sentencing Project.
Okay, well, that's
Today,
good.
we see a return to conversations and
I'm not
debates
too bad,
about the two
Faza.
primary roles of prisons and jails.
We're just looking into
their ideologies
private prisons.
and how those ideologies align with their responsibilities to the incarcerated. As reports of widespread abuses at public jails like Rikers Island in New York have hit the headlines in the early 2010s, we turn again to why a country with a relatively small percentage of the world's population claims such a large percentage of its incarcerated population. And these debates have returned in large part to the same terms they were focused on during 19th century reforms. As prison abolition activists focus on the decline of private and state-run prisons, others have argued that there could be potential ways forward through restorative justice. Restorative justice advocates are looking to practices that center the well-being of both the victim and the accused by seeing if there are ways forward besides incarceration and social isolation. At the heart of it lies the question, what does it mean to forgive someone for a crime they committed after they have paid what we refer to as the metaphorical debt to society? And can true justice look different than just conviction and incarceration? Thanks for watching this episode of Origin of Everything.
Okay, so that's where private prisons come from, but who is making money on these private prisons?
The privatization of prisons and detention centers has been a source of debate for over 3 decades.
There has to be some things in our society that we agree are not a business opportunity.
There's absolutely nothing wrong with profiting off of anything. The question is, are you providing a service with good quality, with humane conditions, and so on?
The moral imperative of government should be to deliver the best outcomes.
The U.S. privatized parts of its state and federal corrections and detention facilities in the 1980s. 2 companies in particular, CoreCivic and Geo Group, have dominated the industry. But the uncertainty of a highly polarized industry stems mainly from the political climate. At the end of President Obama's second term, then Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates announced that the administration would phase out private prisons. CoreCivic and Geo stocks plummeted. 2 months later, President Trump was elected and the stocks soared.
There has been political sensitivity in our stock. It's unfortunate, but our focus continues to be operations. That's what we can control. We can't control the political dynamic.
But lately, things have taken a deeper turn. Democratic candidates call for a total abolition. A number of states have or could be banning the industry. And Wall Street is divesting. On top of it all, prison populations are decreasing.
That's a huge indictment.
Despite all the noise in the market,
I
companies
got
have
you,
very
man.
good liquidity.
How a company is
Night,
structured on
Keelan.
its balance sheet does not save it from a cultural revolution.
Well, I don't know if it's a breaking point or a time of change, but I think it presents, again, an opportunity for us to be more transparent about what we do.
Could this be the
After
beginning
the
of the end for private prisons? At the height of the war on drugs and tough on crime era, the country began imprisoning more people than ever. 750,000 people were incarcerated in America. By 1997, 1.7 million.
Well, we'll see.
With the growing prison population, so were the costs of operating prisons. From 1980 to 1994,
less than an hour.
Operating costs of state and federal prisons went from $3 million to nearly $18 million. Overcrowding was becoming increasingly problematic, and the government couldn't keep up. Private prisons were established to help maintain the $10 billion industry. Private prison companies could build facilities faster without voter approval. They also claimed they could provide a higher quality at a lower price. But the accuracy of that claim has been under scrutiny. No compelling government study is conclusive one way or another. In 1996, the General Accounting Office stated that they were
we
not
have one more
able to
video
conclude
after
that
this,
privatization
and this video is
saved
like
money.
19 more minutes.
A Department of Justice study from 2001 claimed that the average savings from privatization was only about 1% and not the projected 20%.
There are a lot of accounting details that make it difficult to properly compare the cost between public and private, and actually there are a lot of factors that make it difficult to compare quality.
The private prison model was simple: build and manage buildings and secure government contracts. Charge a daily fee for each bed you fill, something called per diem, or what is commonly referred to as mandates. In 1987, Corrections Corporation of America, CCA, today called CoreCivic, charged $32.17 per inmate. By 1997, it charged the government 33% more. However, the company's cost only increased by about 8%. The company's revenue grew 27 times.
Wow.
Brian Evans is the CFO of GEO Group.
So where do I look? At the camera or?
About 2/3 of GEO Group's revenue comes from federal and state corrections and detention contracts. ICE contracts make up a fifth.
Our business changed over the years. In 2003, the chairman and CEO, the founder of the company, George Zoli, had a directive at that time to expand the company into other service lines, diversify, if you will, and to own and operate more of the facilities. So that process started in about 2003. We were about $500 million in revenue. Today we're about $2.5 billion in revenue. Some of that growth has been through acquisitions, about half of it through acquisitions, and about half of it through organic growth, new contracts, new facilities, et cetera.
Sustain us and keep us. Won't let it bring us any hurt or harm or danger. In Jesus' name I pray.
Amen.
In November 2019, CNBC visited a GEO Group prison in Florida. Access to prisons for journalists is unusual, but GEO was able to grant us access with state approval within a week.
We advocated on your behalf to be here because we want you to be here. And we like for people to come here and see what goes on, hopefully to change their minds.
South Bay Correctional Facility is owned by the state of Florida, but has been managed by GEO since 2009, a contract worth $356 million for 11 years. It houses nearly 2,000 inmates that are incarcerated for a variety of crimes, ranging from low-level charges to felonies. GEO is paid $51.11 per inmate, or mandate.
What do they do? What do they use?
South Bay offers a number of educational, vocational, and substance abuse programs, many of which are mandated by the state.
Socially work, school, pharmacy, you rate yourself for the 8.
In 2015, GEO launched its Continuum of Care program. It's an expansion of in-prison programs and includes post-release support. According to the contract, the state pays GEO around $3 million for COC at South Bay.
It was all about, okay, what's our role and responsibility? And that was to provide the most opportunities in making sure that we did everything we could to provide the rehabilitative services so after they left, they wouldn't come back.
Sean Killian was convicted of murder when he was 21 years old. He's 35 now. He's been at South Bay since 2011.
When you're in state-run facilities, if you have longer than a 5-year sentence, basically it's very difficult to get in programs. You know, they give priority to the guys that are about to get out, but at the same time, there's not a lot of programs offered. Here they have so many programs, and everybody's encouraged to take part in them.
Between ICE, U.S. Marshals, Bureau of Prisons, and state, GEO manages about 70 facilities. We asked David Venturella how many of them look like this.
How many of them look like this? Well, I would say all of the facilities that we own either look like this or better. The ones that we manage, I would say, are pretty similar.
But the visit to South Bay is one side of the private prison story. Less than a month prior to the tour, an inmate was flown to a hospital after a stabbing. GEO Group, like CoreCivic and other private prison companies, have been plagued with litigation and claims of human rights abuses.
There's only two ways for a for-profit entity to create revenue. One is to increase your revenue basically by increasing your market share, and secondly, to cut costs. So to lower your expenses and therefore take home more profitability. And so if you're cutting costs when it comes to caring for humans, that's generally not going to put you in a good place.
Do bad things happen in a well-run system? Yes, they do. We don't try to cover it up, and we try to learn from that.
The George Hill Correctional Facility in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, for example, was operated by GEO from 2002 to 2008. 12 inmates died at the facility during that time. They resumed control of the prison in 2017 when they acquired community education centers for $360 million.
This is a jail that has significant issues. We have had instances of wrongful death, suicides that have resulted in very large settlements with families.
Damn.
We've had issues with under-maintenance that's resulted in, I wouldn't call it dangerous, but certainly inhumane conditions, continuous understaffing issues.
Private prison companies occupy about 7% of the total state and federal correctional facilities market. That still produces billions of dollars in revenue. For detention, however, about 75% of total detainees are in private facilities. The funding of detention took off during President Obama's second term, coinciding with the increase in migrants from Central America.
The Senate bill, as currently written and is hitting the floor, would put in place the toughest border enforcement plan that America has ever seen.
Still, in August 2016, then Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates announced her plan to phase out private prisons under the Bureau of Prisons. She said that private prison companies compared poorly to public prisons, largely based on data from a damning OIG report that was published the same month.
I think the Inspector General cherry-picked some areas where we didn't match up as good with the BOP in those specific areas, but overall we had less grievances, we had better rates for inmate violence and assaults and things like that.
Overall grievances were higher in BOP prisons. However, the DOJ selected 8 categories of grievances deemed particularly relevant to safety and security. In that analysis, inmates in private prisons filed 24% more grievances. The stocks plummeted. The Yates announcement would only affect the revenue streams coming from the federal correctional system. Moody saw enough risk and lowered their ratings.
We knew that they, from a liability and liquidity perspective, they were fine, but from a business perspective, we didn't know sort of what was going to happen after this. There was a lot of noise, and this was headline risk that we had always incorporated in our ratings, but this came to fruition.
It didn't come to fruition. 2 months later, Donald Trump was elected president, and within days of coming into office, Attorney General Jeff Sessions rescinded the Yates memo. Stock prices soared.
Private prison companies were those that won the most the following day after the election.
The first year of the Trump administration, where things were going gangbusters for the industry.
Alan Zibel has studied the federal detention and corrections funding.
Trump has obviously been harsher in his treatment of immigrants, but it's really a continuation of a trend. Family detention started under Obama.
If you look at our record over the last 20 years, both under Republican and Democratic administrations, talking at the federal level, there's been steady growth of 5 to 7%, and that's because of the services that we provide and the quality of the services.
Campaign donations depict the industry favoring Republicans over Democrats. Core Civic and GEO Group each donated $250,000 to Trump's inaugural committee. GEO Group's contract revenue from ICE and U.S. Marshals is up by 43% from the last 2 years of President Obama to the first 2 years of the Trump administration. Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced the zero-tolerance policy in April 2018. It was meant to ramp up the criminal prosecution of people entering the United States illegally. But images of separated families at the border and the detention of migrants under questionable conditions
Donald Trump! Shame! Donald Trump! Shame!
unleashed a firestorm.
The immigration policy under this particular administration really disturbed people. The administration lit a fire.
So we're keeping families together, and this will solve...
On June 20th, 2018, President Trump signed an executive order to help the separation of families.
And it continues to be a zero tolerance.
By then, 3,000 children had already been separated from their parents. But it continued, and to this day, the exact number is unclear.
We had no role in operating the border facilities, which is where you saw a lot of pictures of overcrowded, inhumane conditions. Those aren't our facilities. They don't look anything like that. We also don't house unaccompanied minors.
Sparked by an outraged public, the Families Belong Together coalition was formed. 250 organizations came together to protest, collect signatures, and raise awareness and money to help families reunite. But a few wanted more. Jen Armstrong co-authored a report that looked at who was profiting off of the detention of migrants, and private prisons were a part of it.
Something that is really key to understanding about private prisons is that they're actually structured as something called real estate investment trusts, or REITs, R-E-I-T-S. The interesting thing about this structure is that it actually allows these two companies to largely avoid paying income taxes. The flip side of that, however, is that they are actually required to pass on about 90% of their taxable income to investors in the form of dividends. And so they don't actually get to keep much cash on hand, which requires them to really wholly rely on a bunch of short-term borrowing for their operations, for any expansions that they want to do.
That's where Wall Street came in. By mid-2016, GEO had $1.9 billion in debt, and CoreCivic, then CCA, had $1.5 billion, and 6 banks largely financed it.
We know that private prisons make money when we're detaining more people during this immigration crisis, but what people don't see are this large syndicate of banks that are providing all the financing for all the operations for these companies, who are then also profiting through interest and fees and various income that they get from their financing relationships.
Activists took matters into their own hands. The coalition mass organized to urge the banks
I was
to
in your
divest.
stream earlier today, homie. I was lurking. I appreciate the love.
By March 2019,
everybody follow
the
Masi.
group got their first win when J.P. Morgan announced they would no longer bank with the industry. 7 banks have followed suit.
It's actually 87.4% of all of the known financing for lines of credit and term loans for these two companies.
In June 2019, Elizabeth Warren
night, man.
published a statement that if elected, she will shut down the use of federal private detention facilities.
Nice.
Many other candidates have espoused similar intentions. Nevada and California signed into law bans that would eventually phase out private prisons. Colorado and Minnesota could soon. The largest pension fund in the country, the California Public Employees Retirement System, is divesting. So have a number of city pensions. In response, the stocks of GEO and CoreCivic have fallen by 30% since June 2019.
That's exactly what happens when you mass organize. And so when you have every Democratic presidential candidate saying, if I win, private prisons are abolished, that's not just about the candidates themselves. It's now a party stance. And in a two-party system, that business should be very concerned.
We redid our credit facility, which is about $1.8 billion credit facility. We renewed that in June of this year. And most of the other banks participated in that process and renewed with us through 2024. So some of them since then have made public statements that they don't intend to renew in the future, but I think we'll just have to see how that plays out. We continue to dialogue with many of those banks. We dialogue with other institutions. We'll be able to.
Fitch downgraded CoreCivic and changed its outlook to negative. They do not rate Geo Group. Moody's has not changed their rating since 2016.
There's a lot of headline risk, obviously, and despite all the noise in the market,
companies
have very good liquidity. For example, CoreCivic has one bond coming due next year, but they have enough. They have over 600 million in liquidity right now. Geo, they don't have anything due to 2023 either. Both of them are, their retention rates, so far, both of them are in the high 90s. They both reported earnings growth and what they call NOI growth, which is net operating income per the different contracts. They both have added, it's funny to say it this way, but they've all have added people to their beds.
So they're still making fucking money.
So from our perspective, we're very comfortable where our ratings are right now.
Hadan Seagram is an assistant professor of finance at NYU and has studied Geo Group and CoreCivic's balance sheets over a 5-year period.
The business is largely dependent on who's funding and who's in power rather than the fundamentals itself. Therefore, as long as this administration is willing to fund them, they're going to be doing reasonably well. Only issue with these companies, they don't have enough debt financing for growth. So if they don't have that, and if the major banks pull out of it, like Bank of America, JPM, and Wells Fargo, they can be in a steady state, but they cannot grow as much as they want to.
Those concerns may be slowly vanishing. After failing to raise a $250 million term loan back in June, DebtWire reported on December 13, 2019, that CoreCivic was working with a Japanese investment bank to raise the money. Something activists have long feared could be happening.
Divestment is as much about the financial conversation and the financial impact as it is about shifting culture, shifting the narrative, and getting policy to reflect the values of the people. So regardless of how strong CoreCivic's and Geo Group's financials are, the culture can still eliminate them.
A lot can happen between now and when the financing terms mature for CoreCivic and Geo Group. While significantly more expensive, more foreign banks like Nomura can step in and fill the gap. An election can swing things dramatically, and the companies can continue to diversify their portfolios to protect themselves.
Set the children free!
All the while, the American public is more engaged than ever.
You can say, is it the beginning of the end, and does the end look like 2020? Maybe not. But whether the end is 2020 or the end is 2024, it's inevitable. It's coming.
The toss of a coin, pretty much.
We'll see. The last video from Vice.
My kid's not here! He's dead! Because of him! He ruined my fucking life!
In 2011, a judge in Pennsylvania was put on trial.
We turn now to the latest news on the so-called Kids for Cash scandal in Pennsylvania, in which judges took money in exchange for sending thousands of juvenile offenders to for-profit youth jails.
Judge Ciavarella was charged with taking millions of dollars in kickbacks for sending children away for crimes as minor as mocking a teacher online.
He said, well, I'm coming down to arrest her for making a MySpace page about her vice principal.
The scandal was one of many plaguing an industry that has often sought profit over justice.
Many who served in private prisons say officials had incentives to keep prisoners there rather than rehabilitating them.
Today, the U.S. imprisons more people, both per capita and in terms of number of people incarcerated, than any other country in the world.
African Americans are being incarcerated at nearly 5 times the rate of white Americans.
We have more African Americans in this country under criminal supervision right now than all of the slaves in 1850.
In a step to address racial inequity, President Biden signed an executive order in 2021 banning all private prison contracts by the federal government.
This is the first step to stop corporations from profiting off of incarceration.
But companies have found ways to continue profiting off the multi-billion-dollar industry.
As the Trump administration continues to crack down on undocumented immigrants, the majority of them will be sent to detention facilities run by private companies.
This industry has started to shift into what I like to call mass incarceration 2.0.
In Los Angeles County, for example, in the last 6 years has increased the use of electronic monitors by 5,000%.
I don't really like that I have cameras in my house. I don't like being recorded.
So will the private prison ban lead to a fairer justice system?
Justin, you're outside of your facility. You have permission to be away.
I am not outside of my food zone. I was in bed and you just woke me up.
Or has it provoked something altogether more sinister?
Damn.
We must wage what I have called total war against public enemy number one in the United States, the problem of dangerous drugs.
In the 80s and 90s, the war on drugs and harsh sentencing policies meant the US prison population skyrocketed.
Last year alone, over 10,000 drug criminals were convicted.
Overcrowding in this 10-year-old prison is already a problem. 2 to a cell designed for 1.
Private firms stepped in, offering to build more facilities, and faster.
I think we'll see the private sector saving the taxpayers a tremendous amount of money.
But it wasn't long before they had problems.
New questions are being raised tonight about the wisdom of turning public prisons over to private operators.
It became apparent that, in many cases, profits were prioritized over the care of those housed inside.
Private prisons raise a lot of the same issues that are raised in publicly run facilities.
We just saw
However,
you,
these
pretty
issues
lady.
are often exacerbated. In many cases, their officers are wildly underpaid and not paid benefits.
To save on costs, private companies usually offer fewer staff incentives and can struggle to retain employees.
Could you imagine if motherfuckers were keeping you in prison on purpose just to make more money? I mean, it happens. It's happening. We're watching it happen, but damn.
On the day of this 2018 riot in New Mexico, staff numbers were under 50%.
With keys to the entire 40-man cell block and no guards, the inmates take control.
There are only 2 ways to make money. One is to increase your revenues, and one is to decrease your expenses. And in the case of private prisons, increasing revenues means more bodies behind bars, and decreasing expenses means lower care and quality of care for those people who are in your custody.
When Joe Biden became president in 2020, many prison reform advocates were hopeful.
The dream of justice for all will be deferred no longer.
Biden promised criminal justice reform, and his directive 6 days in seemed a step in the right direction.
He says he's pulling America out of the private prison business. It's a break with what the Trump administration had done.
However, for decades, the private prison industry has been finding other ways to fill empty beds.
After just a short time of the complex sitting vacant, it has a new tenant, Immigration and Customs Enforcement.
What is happening is that these private prison industries are turning around and filling these same beds with people in immigration detention.
¡Abre la puerta!
Damn.
1980s, 1990s. You saw the war on drugs. Now we're changing the laws as it pertains to marijuana. We're now seeing these prisons being filled by immigrants.
80% of undocumented immigrants are being held inside privately run facilities, generating over $1 billion for the 2 largest prison companies in 2020.
The Trump administration increased immigrant detention beds by over 50% in 4 years. And what we saw was the administration handed out sweetheart deals to private prison companies.
There's an incredible, I would say, financial incentive not to reduce incarceration, but to change the population.
And changing the population hasn't changed the problems, which range from abuse of solitary to medical neglect. Women in this privately run Georgia detention center accused the gynecologist of carrying out surgeries on them without their consent. The facility was then closed under Biden.
At what point did you realize that you had had surgery?
When I woke up and I saw the incisions, it turns out that I didn't need the procedure that was performed.
The tragedies that we see, particularly in facilities that are run by private prison companies, means death. It means unnecessary sickness and illness.
Their inactions are responsible for Carlos's death.
What these private prison companies have in mind, of course, are their bottom line. And the abuses and the heartbreaks and the tragedies that we see are the unfortunate result of that.
Expanding immigration services is a new source of income for private companies. But there are others, too.
Many of the for-profit firms that manage prisons and detention centers have also diversified.
The reality is that private interests have permeated our correctional carceral system across the country. Permeated our correctional carceral
same ones.
System across the country.
From food and phone calls to healthcare, these companies have monetized all aspects of crime and punishment. Now, they're moving into a new frontier: electronic surveillance.
I told county that if they put 2 beacons up, that the signals would interrupt each other, and that's exactly what's happening. The violations have just gotten worse.
Mohawk Johnson has been on an ankle monitor for nearly 2 years after being arrested for alleged battery at a Black Lives Matter protest. He is still awaiting trial.
I don't really like that I have cameras in my house. I don't like being recorded all the time.
He's placed cameras in his bedroom to capture how often he's woken up to be told he's not in his house.
I am not. I'm in bed. You just woke me up. Please stop waking me up.
They call my actual leg monitor. It starts to vibrate and make a really loud noise.
Mr. Johnson, did you move your beacon?
The sheriff told me to move my beacon because I relocated.
The issues with his monitor have placed him in a constant state of anxiety.
May I ask why I keep getting called at work? This has happened like 6 or 7 times.
It's gotten bad to the point that when my phone vibrates, I get scared because I think I'm in trouble.
I'm literally standing under my beacon.
We're really extending the boundaries of incarceration. Some people incarcerated in their homes, some people incarcerated in the jail.
These firms don't just collect money from the government. They charge people for their own incarceration.
In many cases, you're paying a daily fee to be on electronic monitors. And those would be $5, $10 a day, up to the highest I've seen is $47.
Ankle shackles have emerged as a term for these devices.
I've interviewed many Black people who have been on electronic monitors, and they repeatedly talk about when they look at their ankle, they think of a slave shackle.
Space allowed for each man, 6 foot by 1 foot 6. For each woman, 5 foot by 1 foot 4.
It's definitely a shackle. Like, they always frame it as if they're trying to rehabilitate people, but you can't really like trigger somebody's PTSD nonstop and then say that that's rehabilitative.
We have never asked these firms to focus on rehabilitation. Our experiment with private prisons in the US has been a massive failure.
Following the US's lead, in recent decades, other countries around the world have begun to experiment with privatization.
Scores of refugee and migrant children who were held for months and even years by the Australian government at one of their refugee detention centers. Dozens of children still live in the camp's moldy tents.
I think one thing that always concerns us in the United States is the international precedent that it sets.
They've spread in a number of ways, particularly in the English-speaking world, in the UK, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand.
But as the US starts to question the influence of these companies, what happens if other countries don't?
And my main concern going forward is not so much in developed countries, but in less developed countries where they might be persuaded to go down this road and end up regretting it later.
Wow, so once again, people are trading lives for profit and squeezing as much as they can out of it. Beautiful.